Hello and welcome to Introduction to Philosophy, Fall 2020. I am Professor Langeth. I will be your guide through the text this semester, in which the main goal is to learn something, to come to understand something about what it is we're doing when we think philosophically, or when we do philosophy. The philosopher who's going to be our first guide into that question is the philosopher Mary Midgley, who was an English philosopher. She did not actually begin writing philosophy until rather late in her life. I think she was 55 or 56 when she published her first book. And when she wrote the book that you have and that we're using for the class, she was almost 100 years old. So one noteworthy thing about our text, and in terms of all the books that I've used in introduction to philosophy classes in the past, it's by far the one that was written by the oldest author. So she remained active until the very end of her life, and this book was published about a month before she died, I think it was. So unlike other disciplines, really, I mean, when you start into a biology class or a chemistry class or an algebra class, calculus class, the professor doesn't spend a lot of time wondering what biology is, or what calculus is. Unless you're maybe in an advanced calculus class, you might be thinking about that question. But for the most part, the disciplines are well defined, and the subject matter and the activities associated with it are not in question. The situation is very different with philosophy, almost scandalously and notoriously so, right? Because after thousands of years of doing it, philosophy that is, thinking that books being published by people who we think of as philosophers, and historical periods characterized by philosophy and philosophical thoughts, there's still many, many different answers to the question, well, what is philosophy in the first place? So the way this course is set up is that we're not going to take it for granted that we really know. Unlike in those other disciplines I mentioned, in philosophy, even today, there are many different ways into the question of what philosophy is in the first place. Historically, we can trace where the Western philosophical tradition in any case begins, and we can point out that in the Greek it refers to love of wisdom, but I'm not sure how far that really gets us. And the way I've set up this class is to start the other way around, really, and we start with a contemporary thinker who was very engaged in her work with trying to figure out what philosophy has to teach science and what science might have to teach philosophy. So the relationship between science and philosophy was something very important for Mary Midgley. She wrote many, many books. Some of the most well-known are, she wrote a book on animal intelligence and our relationship with animals, called Why Animals Matter. So you might encounter her actually in an environmental ethics class that looks at the question of our moral and ethical obligations to animals. She wrote a very good book with I think a lot of the themes that are also in the book, in our text, a book called Myths We Live By, in which she makes the case that in a way science has is in a sense a myth too. So we'll talk about that much later. But this book, as I said, published near the end of her life, encompasses almost all of the themes in some way that she thought about in her philosophical career. But if you look at the title of it, right, it's in a sense meant as an introduction to philosophy. It asks the purpose of philosophy, not for a definition necessarily, but it asks, what is philosophy for? What is the purpose of philosophy? So hers will be the first answer we examine to the question, what is philosophy? The goal of the course, obviously, is to introduce you to philosophy. The best way to do that is to start reading and talking about philosophical works, really, and being aware from the beginning that this is a matter of debate and controversy in the philosophical world. How to characterize, what it is we're doing when we think philosophically. Okay, so I want to start by thinking about a few quotes from this very short chapter that I've assigned for week 1. So if you have your text in front of you, and I hope you do, or if you have it on your screen, I'm referring to the chapter Directions. And it starts with a question. What is the aim, the proper object of philosophizing? And then she asks, what are we trying to do when we philosophize? What are we trying to do? And then on the next page, she gives you a picture of what philosophical thinking is like, and she identifies one key characteristic of it that she will then pursue in future chapters. So if you go to the couple of paragraphs beyond the beginning there, we got 3 paragraphs into the book, she mentions that when we're doing philosophy, when we're thinking philosophically, even though we might be tempted to believe that we are starting completely fresh, the famous 17th century philosopher René Descartes, in his Meditations, says that he's going to begin philosophizing by putting aside all of his other beliefs and starting from zero, starting from nothing, and then we'll see where we get. Midgley points out right away that Descartes was wildly mistaken to think that that's even possible, right? So when we start thinking, she writes, we are not starting from nowhere. We are not just riffling through ideas at random. We are always looking for something particular, a link, a connection, a context that will make sense of our present muddled notions. Okay, so that starts to give you a picture of philosophical thought as a way of clarifying what we already believe or what we think we know, say. Making sense of our present muddled notions. So we step back from them, perhaps, we look at them in a different way, we consider them from different points of view, and we try, as one very famous philosopher put it this way, we try to make our ideas clearer. We try to see, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the great 20th century philosopher, would say, we have to come to grips with the picture that has us, right? That's in the background all of the time, but is so familiar to us that we never see it. Rather like the fish, when a fish in a fishbowl, if you ask the fish about, you don't really ask fish questions, but if you ask the fish to explain the water is its element. It's the world that it inhabits and lives in. It would be very difficult for the fish to even be aware of the water. And conceptually, there are pictures that hold us captive too. That's the way Ludwig Wittgenstein talked, and indeed Mary Midgley is very influenced by it. So she says, back to the text, we're looking for something to tie our thoughts together, to suggest a kind of pattern. So she says, thoughts that are now blundering around, loose and detached, need somehow to be drawn into a pattern, perhaps eventually into a single pattern, an all-explaining design. And when one of these patterns seems to be becoming more complete, we approve and begin to speak of it hopefully as a philosophy. So hopefully some of you will continue to take philosophy classes and maybe even become philosophy majors, and you will discover when you study the history of philosophy that a philosophy is often, you could describe it as a kind of worldview, right? So if you start with the most famous philosopher in the history of Western thought, that would be Plato, right, in ancient Greece. And Plato has a characteristic way of viewing the world, a kind of pattern that is present in all of his thinking and all of his works, that once you begin to study him and, in a sense, think the way Plato did, or see the world the way Plato did, you could talk about that in terms of a more and more complete or systematic pattern. Now, the next line is good. Midgley says, this doesn't always work. So one of the things that's absolutely notorious about philosophy that people get a little irritated about, and often students of philosophy can't believe it, right? So philosophers are dealing with the same questions now, in many cases, that philosophers were in ancient Greece. So a very famous philosopher of the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant, the Prussian-German philosopher, raised the question, has philosophy made any progress at all in the way that, say, science has made progress? So if you look at the history of science, you can see that we understand more about the physical universe than the great ancient scientists who were living at the time of Plato. And Kant thought, for example, that it would make sense to say that Isaac Newton represents real progress over Aristotle, as great as Aristotle was, in terms of understanding the physical universe. But what about philosophy? Does it make any progress whatsoever towards solving its central problems? And by the way, what are its central problems, right? What is it looking at? The philosopher Martin Heidegger, the existentialist German philosopher, another famous 20th century thinker, thought that philosophy was always asking one question, and that question was, why is there anything at all? Why are there beings, Heidegger put it, rather than nothing? Why are there beings rather than nothing? Well, how do you make progress towards answering a question like that? And so maybe it's the case that philosophy just has to keep going back to the beginning, back to the start. Midgley, to pick up with her thread again, says, it's as if we're trying to solve a complex jigsaw puzzle which has mistakenly brought together parts of several different pictures, trying to give a single shape to a manifold vision. So the puzzle boxes were mixed up. Oh, this doesn't even go with that one, and this was a picture of the Alps, and that was a ship, and so why are they in the same box, and so on. So what we start with, she argues, in this very nice paragraph on the next page, are scraps of incomplete world pictures. Frameworks, she says, in which loose scraps of experience and of various studies, such as geology, history, mathematics, astronomy, and so forth, can be attached. And these various frameworks do not fit together spontaneously. They have usually grown from different sources, sometimes from distinct social groups which seem to be alien, even hostile to one another. And so we look for ways of reconciling. In philosophy, we look for ways of reconciling the jumbled up world pictures that we find in our random puzzle box in the basement. I'm sitting in my basement now, and my girls have toys across the room, and I'm sure there are boxes with games and puzzles, and they're not always that diligent about keeping things apart, right? And so